Welcome to History 112, Lecture 6, Urban Life. By about 1920, more than half the American population lives in a city, and a city at that time is defined as 2,500 people or more. And while we might conceive of that as being very small, there are cities of significant size. Like New York City, for example, is about 3 million people during that time. That's a decent sized city. Nowhere near as big as it is now, but still pretty big. Now, there were some real limits to urban growth, like high infant mortality, low fertility rates, and disease, but there was a lot of things that were driving urban growth as well. There were more and better paying jobs available. Immigration was driving urban growth. Transportation systems are improving. And there's also a decline in farming, especially on the East Coast. One of the long term consequences of the railroad is it increases geographic mobility, and that's built on by other technologies later, such as the automobile and the airplane. But what's going to happen here is there's going to be a lot of people taking advantage of that. Large numbers are going to move to new farming regions in the west, while at the same time people are also moving to cities in the east. Importantly, a lot of what's going on is leaving women with few sources of rural employment, so the opportunities are simply better in cities for them. There's also the changing nature of farming is going to make it far more dependent on machinery than on far, fixed farm labor. So a lot of the farm labor is going to become migratory or is going to change from farm laborers to people that are going to move to cities. In addition, African Americans begin leaving the South in large numbers. First to places in the north, all the way from Chicago, all the way over on the east to New York City, and then a second wave later that's going to go towards the west coast. And what we're seeing is this beginning of large black communities in the north, with more women than men moving to northern cities during this time. Up until the mid 19th century, most European immigrants tend to be well educated and come with some financial means, although the Irish are a notable exception to that. So a lot of people had established themselves in business or moved west to buy farms. But the late 19th century immigrants are a different story. They lacked the capital to purchase farms or the education to establish themselves in business or professions, so these new immigrants tend to find employment in unskilled fields. By 1890, the majority of the population of several large cities was foreign born or first generation being the children of those foreign born immigrants. And when you look at Chicago, New York, Milwaukee, and Detroit, you're looking at cities that are all 80% foreign born or first generation. And in fact, some of these established such significant ethnic communities that there were more Irish in New York City than in Dublin, the capital of Ireland. There are more Polish people in Chicago than in the capital of Poland in Warsaw. And that was a very common phenomenon. Ethnic neighborhoods brought with them some advantages for people that lived there. Those who don't speak English, for example, could find newspapers and stores that operate in their native languages. Specialty foods and religious organizations would be available. Now, these ethnic neighborhoods tended to reinforce existing cultural values. So, whatever was important in the old country is going to be reflected in these new ethnic communities. So, for example, if a particular ethnic group placed a high value on education, you would see that reflected in educational institutions in that community. And that would bring benefits to people trying to move into professions. On the other hand, what you see is sometimes these ethnic neighborhoods would reinforce other values, like, for example, extended kinship networks and making sure that all of your relatives work together towards a collective goal. In neighborhoods like that, there was a greater value placed on helping your third cousin who had just come from the old country get established than there would be on, say, starting your own business because you're working for the family as a whole and not for yourself. Now, within the immigrant groups, those who arrive with a skill are going to do better and be more successful than those who are not. But racial prejudice overall is going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for some groups to succeed. African Americans and Asians and people from Mexico are going to suffer the worst and most discrimination depending on which parts of the country they're in, and there's going to be significant barriers to their success as a result. These ethnic neighborhoods do tend to see generational conflict emerge over time, because the first generation and the younger immigrants tend to place more value on being American than on maintaining existing cultural identities. The second generation even more so, and that causes a conflict between those older immigrants, say the grandparents, for example, and the grandchildren, where they value different things. And in particular, gender patterns tend to change. Many immigrants expected to arrange marriages and control their daughters' lives until that time. Many immigrant women, however, especially their daughters, are going to increasingly work outside the home due to economic need. And that's not going to necessarily lead to the collapse of old values, but it's going to add tension in these communities as these younger women who are working outside the home, being exposed to more and more what you might call American values, are going to want something different than what their grandparents believed was important. Now, assimilation is a process that's going to happen, especially because those younger generations want to be more American. And there's going to be a lot of factors that are going to speed that along. Public schools, for example, only operate in English. Most jobs this time are English only. American products tend to force immigrants to slowly adapt to American norms because some of the specialty items that they might be accustomed to are no longer available, so they simply repurpose American versions of it. And church leaders are often also pressuring their congregations to assimilate, so there's a lot of things that are going to push them away from the old culture and towards the new Americanized versions of themselves. The expansion of ethnic neighborhoods does lead to a rise in nativism, and most urban disorder and unit strikes are increasingly going to be blamed on foreign born riffraff, as they will call them. And this is in part due to immigrants clinging to old ways, and in part due to ethnic majorities in cities. And what happens is the larger these majorities get, the louder the nativists become, and they start calling for limits on immigration. And you see that in things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and increasing immigrant screening when they're trying to enter the country, and taxes on immigration to try to put an economic barrier there to prevent certain types of immigrants from entering the country. While nativists demanded restrictions on immigration, and some of the restrictions they were able to achieve did limit the ability of certain groups to come, the overall effect was not a significant slowing of immigration. Most native born Americans supported it, actually. Most felt that the benefit of a continual flow of cheap labor outweighed any problems that might come with it. And a lot of people this time argued that industrial and agricultural growth could not be sustained without that immigration. The vast increase in the number of people living in these cities is going to bring about a number of problems. Fires, for example, are one of the more significant ones because many cities do not have a professional fire department. Now, a lot of cities are going to be destroyed by fire, but it's going to allow them to rebuild better and more functional spaces, and that's the point we're going to return to in just a few seconds. Disease is also going to be a big problem because raw sewage, for example, flows the streets and contaminates the water. Sewer systems are not really completed until into the 20th century. Air pollution is very bad because of all the coal that's being burned. And in some cities, there's a perpetual smog over it, and there's high incidence of respiratory disease. The federal government does attempt to create a public health services deal with this, but they're not very effective during this time. There's also high crime rates, with murder rates rising 400% between 1880 and 1900. And many cities are going to respond to this by developing professional police forces for the first time, and they have been reluctant to do so because the police have been elected and supported through a patronage system, so they're going to be very slow to respond to this. Now, by the end of the 19th century, though, most cities had those professional forces, although there were allegations of widespread corruption and brutality. But these are very important steps in dealing with the sort of problems brought on by building bigger and larger cities. In addition, a lot of reformers or planners are going to call for more ordered visions of the cities because they had really grown up in haphazard, irregular fashions, and sometimes they're looking to redevelop districts that are run down. Other times they're looking to rebuild after some of these fires we mentioned a second ago. And they're looking for what they would call a tidy, well-designed, highly functional city. Two important individuals are Olmsted and Vaux, who are going to build Central Park in New York City, and it's going to take them 20 years, but they're going to come up with this completely artificial design to create the feeling of a natural green space that could be there for public enjoyment. And one of the big problems with the cities at the time was they simply lacked the sort of green space and natural environments. And when you factor in all the air pollution and all the overcrowding, having places like that are really, really important. And as these two individuals, Olmsted and Vaux, go on, they not only inspire other people, but they're contracted to do a number of other public spaces as well. Public space is also going to grow up because the wealthy are pushing for it, especially in terms of libraries, museums, theaters, concert halls, and opera houses, which are all the sorts of public spaces that they would enjoy. Now, becoming a patron and benefactor of one of those institutions I just mentioned also tended to be a route to social prominence. The super rich also enjoyed having institutions named after themselves, like the Morgan Library or Carnegie Hall and so on. So that was something you did if you hit a certain social status, was you either donated and became one of the donors on the donor wall, or if you were rich enough, you donated and you had it named after yourself. During this time, the rich are also going to establish a number of fashionable districts, if you will. These are full of mansions located near the cultural and political heart of the city, near the government buildings, and near those opera houses and theaters we mentioned a second ago. But the moderately well-off, they're going to tend to settle on the edges of the city and take advantage of increasing mass transit. That's going to leave the middle class in green, open spaces and enjoyable spaces, somewhat like the rich, although by no means as fancy, but they're going to have to commute. But the rundown, overcrowded parts of the city, those are going to be left to the poor. Now, while mass transportation is going to drive the ability of the middle class to settle in the suburbs, in the beginning of this time period, that's really not what we have. We have haphazard transportation, with most streets being unpaved. There were tram services in some cities before the war that were brought in to help deal with that. But one of the big things that happen are New York City begins the L service. It's an elevated train, where steam-powered trains are going to pull passenger cars around the city on elevated tracks that run above the streets. And Boston is going to begin a subway service by moving their existing trams underground. The functional subway, I understand, is really a British innovation dating from the 1890s. So it's towards the end of this time period that you start to see that as being really a functional and practical system. Now, while increases in transportation allow cities to grow out, some technological changes allow cities to grow up as well. And the two big things that do this are elevators and steel. Now, elevators make it functional to build taller because people are simply not going to go up and down stairs beyond about 6 stories. So that kind of keeps it at that natural limit. Now, in addition, that 6 story limit is also an engineering problem because when you're building out of bricks, you have to build thicker and thicker walls to support the weight. So once you get above about 6 stories, the weight of the building starts to crush the bricks at the base unless you have walls that are so thick to compensate that they're no longer practical. So you really can't go above that. Steel allows you to structurally support the weight in a different way, build thinner walls, and build taller, and the elevators actually allow people to inhabit those buildings in a functional fashion. So a lot of problems exist in these poor neighborhoods. There's a high demand for scarce housing, and that's going to lead to population densities up to 700 people per acre. And if you're having trouble imagining what that would be, just imagine 2,100 people standing on a baseball field. That's the population density we're talking about. Now, because of this demand, there's very little incentive for landlords to invest in their properties because if a tenant leaves, there's always going to be more to follow. And often enough, landlords will not rent an apartment to a single group of people. They'll just jam as many people into the apartment as they can. And oftentimes, these are people who have never met. So, for example, if you're a single man and you wanted to rent a bed, that's what you got, was you got a bed. And you might be in there with 10, 12 roommates who you were about to get to know. Now, more than a million people, especially in New York City, are going to live in tenements, and those are a very important thing to know about. These are multi-story apartment buildings, and you would sometimes see whole families living in a room that was 6 by 9. There was no plumbing or central heating. They often had no windows, and what bathroom facilities existed tended to be in the basement or a courtyard and shared by the entire building. Now, the response to conditions in poor neighborhoods and cities was pretty limited because public and private agencies at the time offered only limited relief, thinking that anything more would cause dependence. There was also a prevailing idea that poverty was caused by laziness or alcoholism. So charity was tended to be restricted to what they called the deserving poor, those who could not help themselves. Blind and widows were usually the examples they used in the 19th century. Now, charities are often going to conduct elaborate, humiliating investigations to determine if a person was truly deserving or not, so a lot of people were being driven away. Now, when charity was provided, it was often linked to some form of moral education. The Salvation Army was an example of an agency set up to do that. Now, the idea of self-improvement limited attention to the sources of poverty, because the idea being if they provided help that allowed an individual to better themselves through some type of moral education, then and only then would that person be elevated out. But instead of looking at what was the underlying cause of why were there so many poor people living in these conditions, they rather chose to focus on individual improvement. Now, where there was a lot of attention was on the gangs of homeless orphans that would run through the city and often be accused of engaging in crime. And that's something that was very popularized in Britain through novels like Charles Dickens, and that also spread back to the United States. So, with regards to children, that was something they cared about. But when it came to adults, they really felt like an adult ought to be able to better themselves through individual effort. The last key feature of these cities are political machines, and the purpose of political machines are to win votes for a candidate. And these machines are run by a boss, and many of them are Irish. Many Irish came over to the United States speaking English or learned it very quickly, and they had a history of secret societies and organized resistance to government, and they were able to very quickly retool that as a political machine. Now, what the political machines do is they assist new immigrants with things like jobs, bail, food, and so on, and they're going to fill a gap because public charity is simply not there. But these individuals will come in and provide jobs and so on to help people get started, and they're going to trade that assistance for votes. Now, after winning an election, they're going to reward key supporters with government jobs. And that's how a system's going to work. Is they're going to get the votes to the candidate they want to win. That candidate they want to win is going to hand out patronage, and they're going to use all of that to then help immigrants get settled so as a form of loyalty. So it's a system of rewards for votes. While political machines are involved in trading rewards for votes, there's certainly a level of corruption involved in that. They're going to have some positives as well. They're going to develop infrastructure in cities that have been neglected by what you might call honest politicians, and they're going to improve city government and expand city services. They're going to overcome weak and inefficient government structures. Some of those weak and inefficient government structures were actually designed as checks and balances. So the checks and balances were causing gridlock and inaction. So they're going to step in and use these corrupt tactics to get things moving in a direction to benefit the people that are their supporters. And they're also going to provide support networks for urban poor. Now, while these are corrupt, without these machines, the poor would have been totally ignored. So while on the one hand they're engaged in political corruption, on the other, they're bringing real benefits to an ignored element of society. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, immigration drives growth, and cities are going to grow up and out, and part of that's going to involve a rethinking of public space, which is mostly going to benefit the rich. Transportation is going to allow the middle class to truly enjoy the suburbs, but that's going to leave behind real challenges for the poor. And importantly, the only group that's really looking after the poor are political machines. See you in the next lecture.